Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover whether trainees should prioritize lifting technique over load lifted or vice versa to maximize muscle growth. So what exactly do we mean when referring to technique versus load? Well, we can manipulate lifting technique in different ways, which allow us to lift more or less weight. So the question here is, should we intentionally adjust technique to maximize load lifted, or should we use a more strict technique that limits how much load we can lift? Throughout the rest of this video, we will answer this question and provide practical advice on what technique is most effective to maximize muscle growth. Let's now explore how technique influences how much load we can lift and the hypertrophic response. To understand this, we will break the concept of technique into a few different categories and explain each individual one. The first technique consideration is range of motion. Range of motion refers to how far the joints move through an exercise and the extent of muscle lengthening and contracting. In almost all cases, a larger range of motion results in decreased lifting performance. In other words, when we lift through a larger range of motion, we cannot perform as many repetitions or lift as much load in each set. However, range of motion also seems to have an influence on hypertrophy outcomes. Generally, training through a larger range of motion results in superior muscle growth compared with partial range. This can be seen in this study, which compared full versus partial range of motion squats on hypertrophy outcomes. It was found that training with a full range of motion, which is shown in the orange bars, resulted in superior quad, adductor, and glute hypertrophy compared with the partial range protocol. However, we can also see here that the average loads lifted in the partial range group, shown in the blue bars, were significantly heavier than the loads lifted in the full range condition. This suggests that although training with a shorter range of motion allows heavier loads to be lifted, it seems to be inferior for muscle growth. So it seems that we should preference full range of motion lifting at the expense of lightening loads in order to maximize muscle growth. Next, let's look at tempo. Tempo refers to the speed or duration of each repetition and can be specified for both the eccentric and concentric portions of the movement. Concentric tempo will always be faster at the beginning of the set and slow down towards the end of a set, so we have less control in intentionally manipulating it. However, eccentric tempo is something we can control with every repetition. In most cases, a faster eccentric tempo will allow heavier loads or more reps to be lifted compared with a slow eccentric. This is probably because a slower eccentric requires active muscle contraction for a longer duration, meaning more total work is performed per repetition and we get more fatigued. Furthermore, eccentric tempo probably doesn't have a significant influence on hypertrophy outcomes. Controlled eccentrics are probably slightly superior than very fast eccentrics, but when sets are taken close to failure, the muscle will be maximally stressed anyway. This can be seen in this study, which compared different eccentric tempos on the leg extension on quadriceps hypertrophy. Trainees performed the same leg extension training protocol, with one group using a faster 2-second eccentric tempo and the other group using a slower 4-second eccentric. It was found that quad hypertrophy was similar between groups, with a slight benefit favoring the slower tempo. However, as we can see here, total number of repetitions performed across the training program was higher with the faster eccentric tempo, shown by the blue bar, compared with the slower tempo. So although lifting with a faster tempo allows superior lifting performance, this doesn't translate to superior muscle growth. A more controlled eccentric tempo will probably result in similar, if not superior muscle growth while limiting lifting performance. The next variable to discuss is joint positions and biomechanics. Trainees can manipulate how an exercise is performed to take advantage of levers and biomechanics. This can allow trainees to lift more or less load depending on how they execute the movement. For example, powerlifters generally use a low bar position for squats to exploit its biomechanical advantage and lift heavier loads. So basically, almost all exercises can be manipulated in a way to maximize lifting performance and also to limit performance. This can be achieved by adjusting joint positions and bar paths to change the biomechanical efficiency of the lift. However, positions and biomechanics may also influence hypertrophy outcomes. While the goal of strength training is to maximize load lifted, for hypertrophy, we want to maximally stress the target muscle. So to maximize muscle growth, we generally want to lift in a way that places the target muscle at a biomechanical disadvantage. This will maximize stress on that muscle and maximally exhaust it. This study explored muscle activation levels of the lower body between the low bar and high bar squat variations. Trainees performed a sub-maximal training protocol with both squat variations, and muscle activity was recorded and compared between exercises. It was found that quadriceps activation was similar between conditions, with a slightly greater activity level in the high bar squat, which is shown here in the light grey bars. While muscle activation isn't a direct measure of hypertrophy, we can assume that this may somewhat translate to long-term muscle growth. This suggests that although manipulating joint positions in biomechanics can significantly influence load lifted, it may result in similar, if not inhibited, muscle activation of the muscles we are trying to train. And the last technique consideration we will cover is strictness. This refers to how much movement occurs at the target muscles and joints compared with movement at other muscles and joints which aren't the target for the exercise. In most cases, movement from other joints which aren't necessarily the target of the exercise will result in more load able to be lifted or more repetitions able to be performed. In other words, when we keep strict form, we probably won't be able to lift as much load or perform as many reps in each set. However, keeping form strict is probably something we want to do to maximize hypertrophy. This is because using other muscles and joints in an exercise doesn't provide any additional stimulus for the target muscle. All it does is use other muscles or joints which aren't actually the target for the exercise. The argument could be made that this will involve more muscle groups and therefore provide a hypertrophic stimulus to more muscle groups, but this is likely not the case. This is because these muscles aren't going to be trained anywhere near failure, so they will not really receive any sort of significant hypertrophy stimulus. So at best, using heavier loads with less strict form may not change the hypertrophic stimulus at all. However, at worst, it could limit the hypertrophic stimulus because the target muscle is not contributing to the movement as much as it otherwise would have been with strict technique. For example, dumbbell bicep curls could be trained with super strict form, and the biceps will receive all the muscular stress and limit performance of each set. Alternatively, we could lift more weight by swinging the hips and using momentum. At best, this will provide an equal hypertrophy stimulus, but chances are that it will actually be a worse stimulus. This is because active muscle contraction is limited at various portions throughout the lift because we are using momentum to swing the weight. This means that the biceps may not be fully stressed throughout the entire range of motion like it would be when we use strict form. So overall, it seems that training with a full range of motion, a controlled eccentric tempo, lifting in a way that maximally stresses the target muscle, and using strict form seems to result in an equal or superior hypertrophy stimulus. However, these factors will all likely limit how much load we can lift or how many reps we can perform too. So if this style of training provides an equal or only slightly superior stimulus, does technique really matter that much? Well, so far we have only looked at the direct effects of technique on hypertrophy. Now we will cover some of the indirect effects on hypertrophy and what this means practically for our training. The first factor to consider is joint stress. Lifting with heavier loads, regardless of technique, induces higher forces on the moving joints. This will increase overall joint stress and ultimately increase our risk of injury. So if we were to lift with a technique that increases how much load we use, we are accumulating more total joint stress on a per set basis. And like we mentioned, this probably isn't going to enhance the training stimulus at all, and it may even inhibit the stimulus. Similar to joint stress, heavier loads are generally more systemically fatiguing too. Systemic fatigue is not a well-defined phenomenon, but it can generally be described as non-specific fatigue of the entire organism. This affects all systems and is affected by all forms of stress. Without going into too much detail, high volumes of heavy lifting generally results in a greater contribution to systemic fatigue compared with the same training with lighter loads. Since hypertrophy style training is generally quite high volume in nature, maximizing load lifted will probably increase our risk of breaching our systemic fatigue capacity. This may increase our likelihood of feeling fatigued and lethargic, decreased perceived energy and mood, and potentially result in poorer health markers and an increased risk of illness. Like we have discussed, lifting heavier at the expense of technique probably won't enhance the hypertrophy stimulus at all, while simultaneously inducing greater systemic fatigue. So what this means is that our technique could potentially limit our volume tolerance in a training program. We know that volume is a key driver of hypertrophy, so we generally want to train with as high of volumes as we can physically and practically tolerate. So if we trade solid technique at the expense of lifting more weight, we are probably going to develop joint pain or breach our systemic fatigue capacity earlier. However, if we drop the load and use strict and effective technique, we can probably handle more total weekly volume before getting injured or becoming excessively fatigued. So as a practical recommendation, it definitely seems most appropriate to prioritize technique over load. This will ensure the target muscle is maximally stressed while limiting unnecessary fatigue and joint stress. It should be noted that this doesn't mean we shouldn't try to lift heavier loads over time. In fact, improving lifting performance over time is a good indicator of long-term muscle growth. However, what this does mean is that we should focus on progression using strict and effective technique. We shouldn't try to increase load lifted at the expense of technique, as the stimulus to fatigue ratio is simply inferior. However, it should also be noted that this is only the case for pure hypertrophy training. If lifters want to improve strength in specific lifts, then trainees should use the technique which allows them to lift the most weight. This doesn't mean that this should be performed for all lifts in a training program, it is only required for the main strength lifts that you want to become stronger at. For example, a lifter may want to perform low bar squats just to parallel depth for strength, and then perform full range of motion, controlled eccentric high bar squats for their hypertrophy work. This will allow them to get the strength benefits of the low bar squats, and then the hypertrophy benefits of the high bar style squats. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.